The shovel struck the hard Texas earth with the same rhythm it had for the past 14 days. Caleb Thornfield wiped sweat from his forehead as curious ranchers gathered along the fence line, pointing and whispering. They couldn't understand why a broke ranch hand would spend his savings on worthless land that floods every spring. Even stranger, why was he digging when everyone knew the ground here was too unstable for building? The hole was now 8 feet deep and perfectly rectangular, like he was following some invisible blueprint. But Caleb had turned down 3 job offers this week to keep digging. Something about the way he measured each corner with an old surveyor's tool didn't match his reputation as just another drifter. The precision was too perfect, too calculated for someone supposedly desperate for work. 3 months ago, Caleb had rolled into Millfield County with nothing but a beaten truck and a toolbox that looked older than he did. The 28-year-old had quickly found work at the Rodriguez Ranch, fixing fences and mucking stalls for barely enough to cover rent on a trailer behind Murphy's gas station. Elena Riverside was the only rancher who paid him fairly, but even she couldn't make sense of his recent behavior. Yesterday, she'd watched him turn down steady work with the Hendersons, who owned the largest spread in the county, just to continue his mysterious excavation project on land nobody wanted. The abandoned plot sat between 3 major ranches, a 20-acre stretch that flooding had made worthless for cattle or crops. Local wisdom said building there was suicide, yet Caleb had paid cash for it without even negotiating the price. Now he worked alone from dawn until dark, stopping only to drink water and study what looked like geological surveys from decades past. The papers were yellow with age, covered in measurements and soil composition notes that made no sense to anyone watching. When ranch foreman Bill Crawford rode over to ask what the hell Caleb thought he was building, the young man had simply said, "Something that'll hold when everything else won't." The answer made no sense, especially coming from someone who slept in a trailer and ate beans from a can. But there was something in Caleb's eyes that stopped Crawford from pushing further, a certainty that seemed out of place for someone with his circumstances. Elena Riverside pulled her truck to the fence line that evening, watching Caleb work by the light of a battery-powered lamp. She'd hired him because he was the only worker who showed up sober and worked without complaining. But this obsessive project worried her. The man barely spoke about his past, and now he was pouring his life savings into digging a hole that defied all local building logic. As she watched him carefully measure another section with his antique surveyor's equipment, Elena noticed something that made her pulse quicken. The tool wasn't just old, it was military grade, the kind used by Army Corps of Engineers. But Caleb had never mentioned military service, and his hands moved across the instruments with the confidence of someone with serious training. What was a man with those skills doing working for minimum wage in rural Texas? And why was he so determined to build something in the one spot everyone else had abandoned? The morning brought news that changed everything for Caleb Thornfield. Elena Riverside's truck kicked up dust as she sped toward his excavation site, a crumpled newspaper in her passenger seat bearing a headline that would have made most men abandon their projects immediately. But Caleb wasn't most men, and what she was about to tell him would only strengthen his resolve to finish what he'd started. "Caleb, you need to see this," Elena called out as she climbed from her truck. The local weather service had issued its first severe storm warning of the season, with meteorologists tracking an unusual weather pattern developing over the Gulf of Mexico. The system showed all the characteristics of the kind of supercell that had devastated Moore, Oklahoma, and Joplin, Missouri in previous years. Advanced Doppler radar indicated rotation within the storm cells, and the National Weather Service was already mentioning the possibility of F4 or F5 tornadoes if conditions aligned correctly. Caleb set down his shovel and accepted the newspaper, his weathered hand steady despite the gravity of the forecast. As he read the technical details about wind shear, atmospheric pressure, and storm tracking models, Elena noticed something peculiar in his expression. Instead of concern or fear, she saw what looked almost like validation, as if the approaching weather system confirmed something he'd been expecting all along. "Most folks are already talking about boarding up windows and heading to relatives in Dallas," Elena said, studying his face for any reaction. "Henderson's moving his cattle to higher ground, and the Morrison family's packing up their mobile home. But you're still out here digging like nothing's changed." Caleb folded the newspaper carefully and handed it back to her. "How deep would you say this foundation needs to be to handle straight-line winds over 150 miles per hour?" The question caught Elena off guard, not just because of its technical specificity, but because it suggested Caleb had been building with extreme weather in mind from the beginning. The hole he'd excavated was already 12 feet deep, with reinforced concrete walls that seemed excessive for anything a ranch hand should be constructing. As if reading her thoughts, Caleb pulled out his antique surveyor's equipment and began taking new measurements. The soil composition here has more clay content than people realize. Floods come and go, but the underlying foundation is solid bedrock about 15 feet down. Perfect for what I'm building. Elena watched him work with growing unease. The precision of his movements, the way he calculated angles and load-bearing requirements, suggested knowledge far beyond what any typical ranch worker would possess. Caleb, what exactly are you building down there? He paused in his measurements and looked directly at her for the first time that morning. Something that'll matter when the storm hits. The certainty in his voice made her skin crawl, not because she doubted his conviction, but because he spoke like a man who knew exactly when that storm would arrive. That evening, as the first clouds gathered on the horizon, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb Thornfield wasn't just preparing for the approaching weather system. He was preparing for something much worse, something he'd seen before. The wind had changed direction overnight, and Caleb felt it in his bones before the weather service confirmed what he already knew. The storm system was accelerating, moving inland faster than initial projections had predicted. By morning, emergency broadcasts were advising residents to secure loose objects and review evacuation procedures. But Caleb remained focused on his concrete work, mixing and pouring with the urgency of a man racing against time. Elena arrived at dawn to find him laying steel reinforcement bars in a pattern that looked more like a military bunker than anything a civilian would construct. The rebar was heavy gauge, the kind used in government buildings designed to withstand extreme stress. She watched him work with growing suspicion, noting how his hands moved with practiced efficiency across calculations that would challenge most engineers. "Where did you learn to build like this?" she asked directly, no longer willing to accept vague answers. Caleb paused in his work, considering how much truth he could afford to share. The concrete truck would arrive in 2 hours, and once that foundation was poured, there would be no turning back from what he was building. "Army Corps of Engineers, 3 tours in Afghanistan," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of memories he rarely discussed. "Specialized in rapid fortification construction in hostile environments. You learn to build things that keep people alive when everything else fails." The admission explained the precision, the advanced planning, and the expensive equipment that seemed beyond a ranch hand's means. Elena felt pieces clicking together, but new questions immediately surfaced. If you have that kind of training, why are you working minimum wage jobs and living in a trailer? The question hung between them like a challenge, forcing Caleb to decide how much of his story he was willing to reveal. He continued laying rebar while he spoke, each piece placed with military precision. "Some experiences change how you see the world. After my discharge, I couldn't handle cities anymore, couldn't deal with the noise and chaos. Found peace in rural work, simple problems with clear solutions." His hands never stopped moving as he talked, but Elena caught something in his voice that suggested his departure from military life hadn't been entirely voluntary. The truth was more complicated than Caleb could explain in the time they had. 3 years ago, his early warning systems had saved over 200 people when a massive tornado swept through a military base in Kansas. His superiors had wanted to transfer him to advanced meteorological prediction, but the weight of that responsibility had broken something inside him. Too many lives depending on his calculations, too many families whose survival hung on his ability to read weather patterns and atmospheric conditions correctly. As the concrete truck rumbled up the dirt road, Caleb made a decision that would change everything for the residents of Millfield County. "Elena, I need you to spread the word quietly. When this storm hits, people are going to need somewhere to go. Traditional storm shelters won't be enough for what's coming." He looked up from his work, and she saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. "How do you know what's coming?" Caleb pulled out his weathered smartphone and showed Elena a collection of meteorological apps that looked nothing like the standard weather forecasts most people relied on. Advanced Doppler radar, atmospheric pressure readings, wind shear analysis, and jet stream tracking filled the screen with data that painted a terrifying picture of what was developing over the Gulf of Mexico. "I've been monitoring this system for 6 days," he said, scrolling through satellite imagery that showed the storm's progression. "The wind shear patterns, the temperature differentials, the way the upper-level disturbance is interacting with surface heating. It's all creating perfect conditions for an outbreak. Not just one tornado, but multiple supercells capable of producing EF4 or EF5 tornadoes. Elena stared at the technical data, understanding enough to realize that Caleb's knowledge went far beyond what any ranch hand should possess. The National Weather Service is calling for severe weather, but they're not predicting anything like what you're describing. They're being conservative because they don't want to cause panic, Caleb replied, accepting the concrete delivery and directing the driver to position the truck for optimal pouring. But I've seen this exact pattern before. Kansas, 3 years ago. The official forecast called for isolated severe thunderstorms. What we got was an EF5 tornado that stayed on the ground for 43 miles. As concrete began flowing into the reinforced foundation, Elena watched Caleb orchestrate the pour with professional expertise. He checked elevation levels, ensured proper consolidation, and monitored the consistency with the attention of someone who understood that lives would depend on this foundation's integrity. The structure he was building wasn't just a storm shelter. It was a fortress designed to protect dozens of people from the kind of catastrophic weather most people only saw in documentaries. "How many people are you planning to fit in there?" Elena asked, beginning to understand the scale of what he was constructing. The foundation was larger than most houses, with multiple chambers, and what appeared to be provisions for ventilation, water storage, and extended occupation. 40 to 50 if we pack them in tight, Caleb answered without hesitation. 3 days of emergency supplies, independent air filtration, and structural integrity rated for winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. He spoke with the clinical precision of someone who had calculated these requirements multiple times, accounting for variables that most people never considered. The concrete truck driver, overhearing the conversation, laughed nervously. "Mister, you're talking about building something that could survive a nuclear attack. This is rural Texas, not Tornado Alley." But his laughter died when he saw the serious expressions on both Caleb and Elena's faces. That afternoon, as the foundation cured and the first clouds gathered on the southern horizon, Elena made a decision that would save her own life and the lives of her neighbors. She began quietly calling other ranchers, not to mock Caleb's project, but to warn them that someone with legitimate expertise was taking the approaching storm very seriously indeed. By evening, word had spread through the county's informal communication network. Some residents dismissed the warnings as the paranoid ravings of a damaged veteran, but others remembered the disasters that had struck communities just like theirs in recent years. Those who chose to listen began preparing for something far worse than the routine severe weather they thought they understood. But Caleb knew they were running out of time, and what he hadn't told Elena was that the storm's projected path would put Millfield County directly in the crosshairs of what meteorologists would later call one of the most destructive tornado outbreaks in Texas history. Sheriff Dennis Walsh pulled his patrol car to the edge of Caleb's property, just as the first emergency sirens began wailing across Millfield County. The official evacuation order had been issued 20 minutes earlier, directing all residents to proceed to the high school gymnasium or leave the county entirely. But Elena Riverside had been calling the sheriff's office all morning, insisting that a veteran with meteorological training was predicting something far worse than the official forecasts suggested. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from this construction site," Walsh said as he approached Elena and Caleb. "The county has designated official shelters, and this unauthorized structure doesn't meet any safety codes. You're putting people at risk by encouraging them to ignore evacuation procedures." Caleb continued installing the ventilation system for his underground shelter, his hands steady despite the confrontation. The concrete had cured perfectly, and he was now 12 hours from completion of a structure designed to protect 50 people from winds exceeding 200 miles per hour. But official approval had never been part of his plan, and local authorities weren't equipped to understand what he'd built. "Sheriff, with respect, your gymnasium won't survive what's coming," Caleb said without looking up from his work. "The meteorological data shows multiple supercells developing, with wind shear patterns that guarantee long-track tornadoes. Your official shelter is a death trap if an EF5 tornado maintains ground contact for more than 30 miles. Elena watched Walsh's expression change as he processed Caleb's technical language. The sheriff had seen enough storm damage in his 20-year career to recognize genuine expertise when he heard it, but county protocols required him to enforce official evacuation orders regardless of civilian predictions. "Listen, son, I don't know what kind of training you have, but the National Weather Service coordinates with local emergency management for a reason. We can't have people making their own decisions about where to ride out severe weather. Walsh's radio crackled with updates from surrounding counties, reporting wind damage and power outages as the storm system moved inland. The argument was interrupted by Elena's neighbor, Maria Santos, who arrived with her 3 young children and an elderly father who refused to leave his ranch. Elena called and said there was a real shelter here. The school's already overcrowded and they're turning people away. Behind her, 2 more families appeared, having made the same calculation that Elena had made about trusting Caleb's expertise over official procedures. Sheriff Walsh found himself facing a situation that his training hadn't prepared him for. Official evacuation procedures were failing, with designated shelters reaching capacity, and many residents refusing to abandon their property. Meanwhile, a man with legitimate military engineering credentials was offering an alternative that seemed technically sound, even if it violated every protocol in the Emergency Management Handbook. As if summoned by the tension, thunder rolled across the prairie with an intensity that made everyone look toward the southern horizon. The storm clouds were still distant, but their massive scale was becoming visible as they consumed the afternoon sky. Caleb checked his phone and saw updated wind speed projections that confirmed his worst fears about what was approaching Millfield County. "Sheriff, you've got about 6 hours before the first tornado touches down," he said quietly. "You can arrest me for unauthorized construction, or you can help me save the lives of people who won't fit in your official shelters." The decision came when Sheriff Walsh's radio erupted with reports from 3 counties south of Millfield. Emergency dispatchers were calling for immediate assistance as multiple tornadoes had touched down simultaneously, overwhelming local resources and destroying 2 official shelters in less than an hour. The storm system was moving faster and more violently than anyone had predicted, except for the man standing in front of them with mud on his boots and certainty in his eyes. "How many people can you actually fit in there?" Walsh asked, his official resistance cracking under the weight of real-time disaster reports. The gymnasium had reached capacity with 120 people, but families kept arriving with nowhere else to go. Elena had been right about the inadequacy of official preparations, and Walsh was experienced enough to recognize when procedures needed to be abandoned for practical survival. Caleb climbed out of his excavation and looked directly at the sheriff for the first time. 50 people maximum, but they'll survive what's coming. The structure is rated for sustained winds of 220 miles per hour, with independent air supply and 3 days of emergency provisions. He paused as another wave of thunder rolled across the prairie, closer now and carrying the distinctive rumble of a massive weather system. "Sheriff, I've been monitoring the storm's progression for 8 days. The rotation signatures and wind shear profiles match exactly what I saw in Kansas 3 years ago, when an EF5 tornado killed 47 people in a community that trusted their official shelter." Elena had been making phone calls while the men talked, and now she approached with a list of families who couldn't fit in the school gymnasium. "The Rodriguez family with 6 kids, the elderly Petersons who can't travel, Maria Santos and her father, the Morrison family whose mobile home won't survive strong winds." She handed the list to Walsh, forcing him to see the human cost of bureaucratic procedures that weren't designed for unprecedented weather events. The sheriff made the hardest decision of his career when he radioed the emergency management coordinator and reported the discovery of an auxiliary shelter constructed by a qualified military engineer. He didn't mention that the shelter lacked official approval, and he didn't question why a man with Caleb's credentials was working as a ranch hand in rural Texas. Sometimes, survival required accepting help from unlikely sources. Within an hour, Elena was driving her truck across the county, evacuating families who had been forgotten by official procedures. She found the Petersons sitting on their porch, resigned to riding out the storm in their 90-year-old farmhouse. She convinced Maria Santos to bring her children by explaining that Caleb had saved over 200 people during his military service. Each family she approached required a different argument, but Elena's determination was fueled by the growing certainty that Caleb's predictions were about to prove devastatingly accurate. As the sun disappeared behind advancing storm clouds, Caleb completed the final installation of his shelter's filtration system. The space below ground was cramped but functional, with battery-powered lighting, emergency medical supplies, and communication equipment that would allow contact with rescue services after the storm passed. He had built it to military specifications, understanding that the difference between survival and death often came down to engineering details that civilian construction ignored. The barometric pressure had dropped 15 millibars in 2 hours, and Caleb's weather monitoring equipment showed rotation developing in multiple storm cells. He looked up from his instruments to see Elena returning with the last group of evacuees, their faces reflecting the fear that came from abandoning everything they owned to trust their lives to a stranger's underground fortress. In 4 hours, everyone would understand why he had spent 3 months building something that seemed impossible for a man with his circumstances. The tornado sirens began wailing at 4:30 in the afternoon, just as Caleb helped the last family down the steel ladder into his underground shelter. 47 people now crowded into the space he had designed for 50, including Maria Santos clutching her infant daughter, the elderly Peterson couple who had refused to leave their farm until Elena personally drove them to safety, and 6 children from the Rodriguez family whose mobile home had already been evacuated by emergency services. Above ground, the sky had transformed into something that defied natural description. Massive supercells stretched across the entire southern horizon, their rotation visible to the naked eye as they approached Millfield County with devastating intensity. Caleb's weather monitoring equipment registered wind speeds that exceeded every measurement in the county's recorded history, while his barometric pressure readings showed the kind of atmospheric violence that meteorologists studied in academic papers rather than experienced firsthand. "Everyone stay calm and move to the center of the shelter," Caleb instructed as he sealed the reinforced steel door that would protect them from what was coming. The space below ground felt impossibly small with nearly 50 people packed together, but the thick concrete walls and steel reinforcement gave the structure an atmosphere of military-grade security that helped calm the frightened families who had trusted their lives to a man they barely knew. Elena found herself pressed against the wall next to Sheriff Walsh, who was monitoring emergency radio traffic with growing horror. 3 tornadoes had already been confirmed on the ground in counties south of Millfield, with wind speeds measured at over 200 miles per hour. The official shelter at the high school was reporting structural damage from straight-line winds, and emergency coordinators were calling for immediate evacuation assistance from neighboring states. Through the ventilation system, they could hear the approaching storm with terrifying clarity. What had started as distant thunder now became a continuous roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. Children began crying as the sound intensified, while adults struggled to maintain composure in the face of something far beyond human control. Caleb moved through the cramped space, checking the structural integrity of his construction while offering quiet reassurance to families who were experiencing the most dangerous weather event of their lives. The first direct impact came without warning. One moment they were listening to approaching wind, and the next moment the shelter was surrounded by a sound that defied description. Not wind, but something far more violent and concentrated. The steel door vibrated against its reinforced frame, while the concrete walls transmitted vibrations that suggested massive forces trying to tear the structure from its foundation. Maria Santos pressed her baby closer to her chest as the shelter's emergency lighting flickered under the strain of whatever was happening above them. Through the radio, they heard Sheriff Walsh's dispatcher reporting that a massive tornado had touched down directly over their location, with preliminary estimates suggesting EF4 or EF5 intensity. For the next 20 minutes, their survival would depend entirely on the engineering calculations that Caleb had performed in solitude over the past 3 months. As debris began impacting the shelter's ventilation system, everyone understood that they were experiencing something that would define the rest of their lives. The question was whether Caleb's military training and obsessive preparation would prove sufficient to protect 47 people from the most powerful natural force on Earth. The tornado passed directly over Caleb's shelter for 17 minutes that felt like hours. Above them, an EF5 tornado with wind speeds exceeding 230 miles per hour carved a path of destruction through Millfield County, destroying everything in its path except for the reinforced concrete structure that protected 40 families who had trusted a poor ranch hand with their lives. When the roaring finally subsided and the steel door stopped vibrating against its frame, Caleb waited an additional 30 minutes before unsealing the entrance. Emergency protocol demanded patience even when silence suggested safety, because secondary tornadoes often followed the primary system with deadly efficiency. His weather monitoring equipment showed the supercell moving northeast, but atmospheric conditions remained unstable enough to require continued caution. The first person to emerge from the underground shelter was Elena Riverside, who climbed the steel ladder into a world that no longer resembled the one they had left 6 hours earlier. Where the Rodriguez ranch house had stood, only a concrete foundation remained. The Morrison family's mobile home had vanished entirely, leaving nothing but scattered debris across a landscape that looked like a war zone. Trees that had stood for decades were reduced to splinters, while vehicles had been tossed hundreds of yards from their original positions. But 47 people from 40 families were alive because Caleb Thornfield had spent 3 months building something that everyone else thought was unnecessary. The Peterson elderly couple emerged blinking into the late afternoon sunlight, followed by Maria Santos carrying her infant daughter. Then the 6 Rodriguez children whose parents wept with relief as they realized their decision to trust Caleb had saved their lives. Family after family climbed out of the shelter, each one representing a survival story that would be remembered for generations. 47 people from 40 families had been saved by trusting a poor ranch hand with their lives. Sheriff Walsh was among the last to emerge, his radio immediately crackling with emergency traffic as rescue coordinators tried to assess the scope of destruction across 3 counties. The official shelter at the high school had suffered catastrophic roof damage, forcing 120 people to evacuate to the basement during the tornado's approach. Multiple fatalities were being reported from communities that had relied on conventional storm shelters designed for lesser weather events. "Caleb, how did you know?" Elena asked as they stood among the debris that had once been familiar landmarks. The young man who had worked for minimum wage just days earlier now surveyed the destruction with the calm professionalism of someone who had seen similar devastation before and understood the precise engineering requirements for surviving it. "I've seen what these storms can do when people aren't prepared," he replied quietly, checking his phone for updated weather information. 3 years ago in Kansas, I watched good people die because their shelters weren't built to handle the reality of extreme weather. I couldn't let that happen again." By evening, news crews were arriving to document what meteorologists were already calling one of the most destructive tornado outbreaks in Texas history. But in the midst of widespread destruction, they found an extraordinary story of preparation and survival. Caleb Thornfield, the poor ranch hand who had been dismissed and ridiculed for his obsessive construction project, had single-handedly saved 47 people from 40 families from certain death. The community that had once questioned his judgment now understood that his military training and meteorological expertise had been their salvation. Elena Riverside offered him a permanent position managing storm preparedness for the entire county, while Sheriff Walsh recommended him for recognition by the State Emergency Management Agency. But Caleb had already begun planning his next project, because he knew that extreme weather was becoming more frequent, and other communities would need someone who understood how to build shelters that could protect lives when everything else failed. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where courage and determination change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.